All right, Dr. Muehsam, thank you for talking with me for this book. I'm really interested in what kind of biography encourages someone to go against the established scientific paradigm. So,
Hmm.
why are you willing to take on fairly unorthodox research topics?
Well, I think primarily it comes from making logical deductions about what's interesting to study. For example, we look at parapsychology as a kind of an outside fringe region of science, which is not entirely accepted by mainstream scientists. Yet there's a very large body of reports that suggest to me, when I look at that literature, that this is something that we should know about, that we should inquire about. I think we all have personal experiences of thinking the same thought as someone who's close to us, or having a sense of who's that ring on the telephone, that sort of thing. Rupert Sheldrake's work with people knowing when they're being stared at from behind. Um, Dean Radin's body of work and the summaries that he's written in some of his books. So I think for me, if it's a question of truthfulness. If I'm going to be true to what I think is worthy of study at this time, then it's hard to say, well, parapsychology, I shouldn't study that. Maybe I'll be not as well funded as if I studied something else. But it just seems to me like there shouldn't be topics in science that are on the fringe for irrational reasons. And once there's a certain amount of data that supports the notion that further research would turn up interesting results, I feel as a scientist that we're actually obligated to look in those areas. Now, the personal motivations behind that are interesting. In our early discussion, we spoke a bit about Frank Sulloway's book, Born to Rebel, where he looked at birth order in the family. He found, by studying a large number of scientists through the last few hundred years of history, that the younger born scientists tended to be the ones who were innovators more than the early born or the eldest children, who tended to be more conventional scientists who would defend the status quo. So what the emotional reasons for may vary a great deal, and it may be as simple as something like birth order, that the rebels tend to want to think outside the box as well. But as a scientist, from my perspective as a scientist, I think many of these areas that are considered fringe, such as parapsychology, there's enough data to make me personally curious. I can't dismiss it all out of hand. And just
Have you read
because
the Galileo report? Do you know
I
that
have
one?
not read that, no.
Well, it bothered me in there because they say we agree that the scientific studies are not what they should be in parapsychology because they're not replicable, because they change different
Mm-hmm.
aspects of the study. So I asked Dean Radin about that, and he said most social science research isn't replicable because you're working with
Mm.
human beings, not bacteria cells in a petri dish. So I'm wondering how you would respond to that idea that the replicability problem is so great that you can't really say there's scientific validity for, I don't know,
Mm.
NDEs staring at people from distant rooms and their bodies react, all the parapsychology studies.
Well, I think there are two answers that combine in this case. Hopefully, I can remember what the second one will be. I think, firstly, that many experiments that we see in the psychological sciences, even in cell biology, are not replicated. And often one runs the same experiment twice and gets slightly different results. There's variability. If one looks at the body of material that came out of some of the parapsychological research laboratories, for example, the Pear Lab in Princeton, Robert John's laboratory, there's a lot of statistical significance in those outcomes. And people will always bicker about, well, this loophole or that loophole, and so on and so forth. And I think that's important with exceptional claims like this. But nonetheless, many of the studies produce high levels of statistical significance. There was also a time, I remember speaking with Brenda Dunn, and she said there was a period of time, some number of months, when they didn't seem to find so many correlations in the lab at Princeton, and they never could explain it. So there are issues that as time goes by, the human being is different, great deal of variability between people. But to my reading, in parapsychology, there are a large number of experiments, even if they'd only been executed once, that did produce high levels of statistical significance. And that interests me. To dismiss them out of hand would be the justification for dismissing biology experiments that I don't like out of hand, because they used a sample population that could never be repeated a second time, or a batch of cells that was now defunct, something like that. I think the second thing is that at some point when we talk about the study of parapsychology, we have to talk about things like experiment or expectancy effects. The notion that those that believe more appear to produce greater outcomes on parapsychological testing. This is summarized in Dean Radin's recent book. Tell me the title again.
Magic.
Yeah, Real
Magic.
That's Real Magic. He gives a nice summary of that aspect. The skeptics tend to score lower on parapsychological tests, and you can kind of imagine why. And at some level, if we're interacting with the outcomes of events, whether it's random number generators or the ability to perceive a remote location, something of that nature, we may be crossing a kind of boundary, crossing what I like to call the edge of objectivity, where there's a subjective element that plays a role. It may be the experimental ambience of the lab, where if the staff are skeptics, there's a greater resistance. Some of these things can be tested. Some of them are a little bit more slippery to put a handle on. But at some point we enter into an area where the subjective experience becomes one of the variables. It starts to sound like quantum mechanics. And of course, that's one of the reasons why quantum mechanics has been very attractive to people who want to explain parapsychology. So that's another aspect to the thing, is that we may need to broaden our concept rather than trying to isolate the parapsychological interaction into a fully controllable, completely objective framework. We may have to accept that there are some subjective elements in there, some of which we can control, like what kind of experimenters we have. Maybe do the experiment at the right phase of the moon or whatever it is. But others of which we may not be able to control. We may not be able to even classify, things that we don't know are there yet.
To me, that's one of the most profound implications of this psi research, is the beliefs and intention of the observer have great effect. And but it's just like, it's just placebo effect. Hello? Placebo effect, observer effect, experimenter expectation effect. Hey, those are huge. We should harness the power of that kind of thinking and use it, not dismiss it.
I agree, and I think we're starting to do that already. You look at the growth of mind-body stress reduction techniques and the way they've been implemented in clinical practice, and I think that's a beginning. It's a start. That if we change our level of stress, for example, that has a impact on health, and that's starting to get into the belief system that if we change our inner self, that reflects in the outer self, and it crosses that edge of objectivity. It begins to utilize these things for a good purpose. So some of the quandaries may be more philosophical, having to do with our need to objectify, rather than practical, where the goal will be to reduce suffering, to develop ways that people can live happier, more healthy, meaningful lives, and so on and so forth. And that changes the perspective of the science somewhat.
And that leads us to the idea that you are creating a new paradigm, or actually it's a very old paradigm, but it's new in the Western world, and where consciousness is primary, not material or the brain. Could you say a word about, do you think we're creating a new scientific paradigm?
Well, I don't think I'm creating a new paradigm. I think I'm being swept up in maybe a kind of recognizance of some older ideas. I think notions around consciousness and vitalism have been around for thousands of years in various forms, in interesting non-dualistic forms in Vedic thought, for example, in an interesting dualistic form in Jain thought. The Indo-Tibetan region has several philosophies, in China as well, that embody those ideas, that there's a kind of preeminence to consciousness, or that there's a consciousness stuff that relates to the nature of the mind and the emotions and interacts with the physical world. We see this in the various theories of yoga and so on and so forth. I think in today's science, I'm a biophysicist and my background is in bioelectromagnetics. So I guess that's the direction that I moved into this area from. And when I first started working in 1991 with Arthur Pilla at Mount Sinai in New York, I was very interested in weak magnetic field interactions. And the reason this fascinated me was because the apparent interaction energies of a weak field, like the geomagnetic field, or even weaker than that, are very, very far below the thermal motion, the Brownian thermal motion of all the molecules that just jiggle because they're at a certain temperature, 37 degrees inside the body, for example. And there were lots of arguments around this. How could this be possible that we could have a magnetic field interaction at such apparently low interaction energies? And we had a colleague who we famously debated us through a sequence of papers, which was a really fun process. And he argued effectively, and I think rightfully so, on theoretical grounds against the existence of a variety of types of these non-thermal or subthermal electromagnetic field effects. And he was valiant about it. He carried that banner across the field, even in the face of an onslaught of experimental data to the contrary. And, there was an interesting example of the belief system in the science, and also a great example of the system of checks and balances, because without this colleague who was playing the advocate of the devil, we wouldn't have been as good. We wouldn't have learned as much. We wouldn't have thought about all of the criticisms that he had. But what we wound up seeing, and what's really been confirmed over the last 25, 30, 40, 50 years, depending on how one measures, is that there are a variety of mechanisms for weak electromagnetic field effects, some of which have been really, really well fleshed out, like, for example, the free radical mechanism that underlies a lot of animal navigation. Some very, very elegant papers. Still lots of details to work out, but it's pretty clear that there's a mechanism on reactive oxygen species in the body where the sensing of the magnetic field at the level of the geomagnetic field, which isn't so strong, is done by lots of different types of animals. There's still many, many open questions around how electric and magnetic fields, particularly magnetic fields of low intensity and low frequency, affect the body. And the existence of resonances, different types of conditions under which those occur. So we're still learning a great deal, and we're in the nascent stages, for sure. But what is really exciting about that is that we see that this subthermal, these weak electromagnetic fields, they do affect the body. And in fact, some of them are cleared by the Food and Drug Administration for the treatment of pain or edema, the healing of wounds, bone repair, and so on and so forth. And as you know, there's a cottage industry of folks selling pulsed electromagnetic fields for everything from baldness to athlete's foot. So what we see is that there are interactions that are biologically relevant, that affect our states of growth and repair, and perhaps well-being generally, that are operating at these very, very low energies and affecting this stuff that's at 37 degrees Celsius. Yeah, it's quite warm. And this I found fascinating. When I was younger...
Is the Rife machine an example of a device that uses that kind of frequency?
I guess so. It's putting out a pretty high amplitude signal. So some of the components may be high enough to actually physically move things around. There's a sort of signal to thermal to noise ratio. I'd have to really look at the signal again. to tell you if it was purely below that level or not. There are lots of devices that will produce a little bit of heating. Early diathermy devices, which also can assist in pain and edema and repair of chronic wounds, they could produce a little bit of heating when you dial them up into the highest setting. So I'm not sure if the Rife machine fully qualifies as being a very, very low-level subthermal. There's a lot of juice being put out by those things.
Mm. So when hands-on healers are doing Reiki or external Qigong or Jo-Ray or healing touch, do you think they are in some ways using the same thing but organic rather than from a machine?
I don't know. I think it's a very interesting question. There have been many, many reports of emissions from Qigong practitioners and other healers, notably lots of reports from China for emission of just about every frequency of electromagnetic fields, infrasound, and light, and all kinds of things like that. And again, they fall into that category of studies that haven't been fully replicated. It's a convenient explanation that we're emitting a field, and maybe it's very, very low, just like the Wi-Fi field or a Bluetooth field. It does communicate information. It's interesting with healing because there are many reports of healing at a distance, and also in parapsychology, there's quite a body of data on parapsychological interactions that happen across hundreds or thousands of miles. So this makes an electromagnetic field mechanism seem less likely because, your radio drops as you drive away from the station. And we couldn't really see how, if it was modulated just through an electromagnetic field, we could have a kind of signal specificity that far. And this has led to speculations around quantum entanglement and so on and so forth for healer effects and parapsychology. I don't know. It's a very good question. We did a sequence of experiments at Sinai in 1994 with some Qigong practitioners. They had just arrived from China. And we found that when we shielded the samples, the effects that we observed seemed to go away. So that would suggest an electromagnetic field was part of the interaction. But they were also, in the shielding experiments, they had this big box around the test tubes that they were trying to treat. So it could have just been an effect on their psychology or their practice. I think there's a lot of work to do to understand more about what the mechanisms for these things are. And it may be, I don't want to cut to the chase too quickly because we have some more time in the interview, but you ask most scientists, well, do you understand quantum mechanics? And they'll say, well, no. Is it possible to understand?
It's too
and
weird
I don't want
and
to,
spooky.
Yeah, exactly. Spooky action at a distance. And I don't want to foist everything off on quantum mechanics and make quantum theory responsible for parapsychology. But it may be that it's very difficult for us to understand how these types of things work because of our point of view. And sort of to cut to the chase, we are coming from a point of view of separateness. And from that point of view, then we need a carrier. And it's a very interesting point of view. And of course, as we know, lots of cultures around the world, different times in history, had more animistic or more unistic, I'm not sure what the word would be, not unified, but more interconnected views of the world and a sense of the spirit world or the psychic world playing a larger role in life than we do. We're focused on material mechanisms first in our culture. And again, I don't want to say that the laws of physics are culturally specific, that they only work in academic ivory towers, and they are emitted from those, like cell phone radiation. That's a little bit too relativistic for me. But nonetheless, it may be more of an ontological question, how we explain these things, rather than finding the radio beam or the quantum entanglement that solves the problem for us. Certainly, it's interesting to speculate about the role that quantum mechanics plays in something like parapsychology, because this quantum entanglement, this spooky action of the distance that you mentioned, It's been verified over and over and over again, and one can't say no. I think one of the big difficulties there is, just briefly, that there have been some very valid arguments around things like decoherence times. If you have two particles that are entangled and they go flying off in two different directions, you can interact with this one over here, and that instantaneously changes the outcome over here. Go faster than light, just right away, because they're really mathematically the same state. In order for that experiment to work, you can't have a whole lot of other particles hitting the particles as they're going away, because that'll turn them into other particles, knock them off their trajectory, and so on and so forth. And so if we have quantum entanglement between me and you, then what's the medium? What's keeping the particles in the different places from decohering? And I think it's both a technical as well as a philosophical argument amongst physicists. I've seen papers to the effect that the whole universe is one big entangled state in theoretical physics. I can't cite the citation right now, but that, and on the other side of the extreme, the idea that macroscopic entanglement can't occur at all because of this argument of decoherence, which I think is a very valid point of view, and it needs to be addressed by people that want to explain parapsychology and consciousness using quantum mechanics. We'd have to show that there's a way that this is happening. Now, last year, the Chinese showed a form of entanglement between two cities at a satellite. So I'll never say never.
Wait, what did they show?
They passed a signal between two cities with a satellite and showed that there was an entanglement between the received signals at the two cities. And they were something like 1,200 kilometers apart.
Some people use the image of the hologram. So
Mm-hmm.
it's like everything is in everything else kind of a deal. So you're not really separating two objects. They're still one somehow.
That's right. Fields within fields. I love the idea, and it's so beautiful that it's the kind of thing that inspires one to study nature. This notion that the whole is embodied in to see the universe in a grain of sand, like William Blake said. And just because a theory is really attractive and I like it, and it feeds my soul somehow, doesn't mean it's the right theory. So I think there's plenty of work to be done to really show this, and I think we see these metaphors, a great number of them, in the existence of scaling patterns in nature, fractals, where at one level you see a certain type of structure that's then repeated at the larger level and the larger level. We see these types of structures in nervous system signals. If we look at the way they change across time and so forth, they have a fractality that has a significance to the meaning of the information that's conveyed by the signal and so forth. So I think there's a very strong set of data that supports this idea. But whether we can really say in the one the many and in the many the one, and go to that sort of philosophical extent with it based purely upon what we know scientifically, I'd have to say, well, let's do a little more work first.
It is interesting
we need a bit more time.
When you think about the repetition of the pattern of the spiral, like the seashells in the spiral and the galaxies in the spiral. And some people have said, well, the basic kind of geometric shape is the toroid, and the universe works with this kind of figure eight energy coming in through the bottom and the top. Does that say anything to you?
Well, sure. I don't even know where to start on that one. Roger Penrose and his spinors, maybe that was a primary inspiration for that, where he modeled elementary particles as spinors in space-time. Elizabeth Rauscher picked up on that and wrote a couple of really interesting papers that are nice to look at for physicists. When we look at magnetic fields, they tend to take that toroidal shape, a spinning dipole. And it's kind of an interesting thing because if we think about space and time just in the very abstract, if we localize a point, then we don't have a direction necessarily. But if we introduce a spin at the point, that defines an axis around the spin. And that naturally defines a kind of toroidal or at least cylindrical geometry. if you put a magnetic field into that, then of course you do get a toroid. And you see that everywhere from the insides of apples to the formation of galaxies. A whole number of things take that form. You look at the work of Nassim Haramein, and he's made some beautiful metaphors and some lovely animations as well of toroidal geometries and vortices and so forth. So I think it's a very, very attractive idea. We'll probably see more of it. It probably becomes a kind of topological knot theory to understand chemistry from that. So I hope the next generation will, after I'm gone, and do something with that.
What kind of research have you been doing, say, in the last decade? You talked about some 1990s. What have you been doing since then?
Well, I've been working in EMF therapeutics, done a number of laboratory studies on the effects of electromagnetic fields on hemoglobin deoxygenation, effects of electromagnetic fields on stem cells and their gene expression, effects on the cytoskeleton of cells, the stuff that makes the cell shape, and the microtubular transmission there. Recently, we went to India and we measured electrophysiology, brainwave, EEG, electroencephalography, and electrocardiography, ECG, of people who were doing religious ceremonies and in group meditation. And we're looking at the ways that the brainwaves of the individuals in the group meditation might become linked together, showing similar responses, or even coming into phase during the group activity. So I'm very interested in moving to this direction where we can understand more about what's happening inside of us during different kinds of activities and how the devices that we can use to collect data can show us that. And in the group context, how there can be a synergy that's very different to meditate in a group, to meditate alone, and so on and so forth.
Is there any preliminary data from what you studied in Tamil Nadu?
Yeah, there is, but it's just being analyzed right now. So I expect to have the results in a few weeks. I can't really say what's there yet.
Okay. But did you, just on a personal level, feel that the atmosphere was different when the group was meditating than when they were just going around their daily activities?
Well, yeah, certainly. And when you any kind of group gathering that has some intention, whether it's a musical concert or a community event or a religious setting, I think the group energy can just be huge, and I think that changes the experience a lot. I think that the thing for me that's interesting about that story is that we see more and more, and this is a direction that I've been moving in the last 10 years or so in my life more and more, that each of us individuals is part of the societal organism. Our friends, our family, our colleagues, our tribe, our nation, our species, the whole planet, and so forth. And we see a lot of evidence from psychosocial genomics and psychoneuroimmunology, with example, that really strongly suggests that our well-being, our capacity to deal with inflammation, to deal with stress, to deal with immune challenges, has a lot to do with our social state as well. Steve Cole at UCLA, for example, has done some very interesting studies on the effects of social isolation on gene expression for immune responses and inflammatory signaling molecules. And when people are more, generally speaking, social isolation and probably the stress that comes from that can reduce the immune response and increase the amount of inflammation inside the body. Not just inside the brain.
It would be interesting to study prisoners who are in solitary isolation. I mean, they'd be an easy group to study because they're clearly isolated.
They would, yeah. I think also, there are lots of experiments that we could do on that level. But I think the point I'm trying to make is simply that we're seeing that we're part of a larger organism. And if it's this idea that the one reflects the many and so on and so forth, that's a big step, I think, for our science. Instead of looking at me as a biological automaton, and my state of health or well-being is mostly dependent upon what kind of food I eat and air I breathe and whether I exercise and so on and so forth. That's just a limited point of view. And as we start to move to a more social point of view, then we start to see the interconnections that we have. And so this also interests me. Well, why is it that in group meditation we often do have a very different kind of experience than when I'm alone on my mat? And I think that the potential for science to give us information about this is really very, very, very great. This work of Steve Cole, for example, when I first learned about it, it made a very deep impression on me because here was the inside speaking to the outside. And also the way that my inside, my inner state, spoke to my social group and how I interact with them, and bringing questions of how we can make healthier social environments so that people can live healthier lives.
We've known for a long time that the orphans in Eastern Europe had really bad health outcomes because they weren't held and cared for. They were fed and clothed, but they weren't loved. And so it's not new information that we're social beings.
I think you're right. And it may really be that the biologists took a while to catch up to some stuff that people in the social sciences have known for a long time.
What also this makes me think of is William Benston's healing of mice that were injected with breast cancer cells. They found a resonance effect so that the cradles where the mice were kept that were sent the healing energy had a resonance effect, and you could put a mice in there and they would be healed even if there was no human involvement at that point. That's really profound.
It's really interesting, and it's a little bit ineffable. I've had the experience of walking into a room where a lot of meditation has been done, and maybe it's all just my imagination, but there's a sense, or if I walk into a sacred place, there's a feeling, and often it's palpable. And because I find that personally attractive, I seek out those places. So I'm not objective in this kind of evaluation. But nonetheless, maybe there's some kind of imprint or patterning that does change things. I'd hesitate to guess on the mechanism right now, but there is a literature on the effects of intention, imbuing devices or even mobile phone apps with intention. And I recall a double-blind, placebo-controlled study that used an app like that showed statistically significant changes in heart rate variability parameters, whether the app was there or not. And there was intention somehow, I don't know how because it was proprietary in the study, but there was intention imprinted upon this app, and if it was running in the phone next to a person on a table, their heart rate variability was different than if the phone didn't have the app loaded.
Wow, and
the phone, by the way, wasn't transmitting at the time.
And the phone
so this is pretty far out.
Yeah, the phone didn't have sound. It just had a vibratory imprint.
Yeah, and it wasn't the buzzer going bzz, bzz, bzz when it rings or the message comes in. It was just whether the app was there or not. And this was performed by Beverly Rubik and published in the Journal of Alternative and Complementary Medicine. I think it was last year.
That's like homeopathy, that you may not have an atom of the original calcium or phosphorus or whatever, and it still is impactful.
Yeah, I'm not an authority on that, so it's hard for me to chime in. I know that there's been a lot of work on homeopathy, and I'm seeing new information coming out fairly frequently about it. There have been a lot of speculations around the idea that one serially dilutes homeopathic remedies, some nanoparticles of the original stuff do remain, and that could have an effect on the water clustering, etc. So I think we're a long way from really understanding to take it from another perspective, the idea of holy water or water that's been blessed or water that has healing properties
At Lourdes.
is at Lourdes or at that well around, up in the Irish countryside with the tree, with the ribbons people have tied into the branches next to it. This goes back a long, long way in many, many, many cultures. And we see some reflections of it in work like the work of Emoto in Japan, who froze water droplets. I'd love to see this stuff systematically studied a little bit more, because there's some fascinating ideas there, but for the amount of information that I'm able to access around it, it's hard for me to really draw conclusions. There is a body of literature on electromagnetic field effects on water, particularly on colloidal solutions, a lot of which came out in, I guess, the 80s and 90s out of Japan, where they found changes in things like surface tension and the solubility or the zeta potential, how much energy it requires to take something out of the solution, with electromagnetic fields. And sometimes those changes lasted for up to, I think, something like 143 hours was the longest one that I saw in one of the papers. So that's a memory effect on water. And sort of going down that rabbit hole just a little further, there's a practice in place today of using magnetic fields or electromagnetic fields around pipes that are subject to fouling. For example, in heat exchangers where milk is being pasteurized, or liquids that tend to cling to the pipes have to pass through. And those are used to reduce the scaling, which keeps things up and running longer before you have to clean the pipes. So there are a great many of those being used today. It may be that there'll be a confluence from our better understanding of water and solutions in water and how electromagnetic fields affect them, and maybe how intention could affect them. Again, I don't want to sound like a broken record, and if we go along these lines, I'll always be saying, my goodness, we just need to do more research. There are a lot of interesting questions, and many of them could be answered in a fairly straightforward way.
The water issue is profound since we're 80% water in our bodies. So if water has memory, you could imprint strong immune system intentions.
Yeah, maybe water is part of the story, and that there's a whole symphony of different frequencies going on here, and we need to find a way to understand on that level. Now, it's a big paradigm shift. The molecular biological way of looking at life, where molecules fit together like this, has been incredibly successful. And I think it's given us a very accurate view of a number of things that happen. The problem is it gets complex really quickly. And so I think in order to feel like we have a better understanding, it would be very nice to have an idea. Well, is there a field that governs the behaviors? Are there global organizing principles that are acting here? What are some of the ways that this form comes out of just having some DNA blobbing around in an embryo? And Mike Levin, for example, at Tufts University, has made, I think, some very significant progress. You can look, there are a few papers. One, I think, is called Cracking the Bioelectric Code. And he's done a body of research on looking at how patterns of membrane potentials in embryos, and basically mostly embryos, but also in planaria who are cut into pieces and dividing and regrowing and so forth, how the patterns of electrical potentials in the cell membranes play a role in the morphogenesis and the shape that comes out and where the eyeball is, for example, and so on and so forth. So we may be on the brink of some very, very profoundly new understandings. We see how the molecular clockwork works to some degree. Molecular biology has made enormous strides at that specific local level of which molecules interact. And perhaps through work like Michael Levin's, work in bioelectromagnetics, generally speaking, we may begin to understand some more of how larger scale information gets transported or conveyed in development and in growth and repair. Well, how does the salamander grow back the leg?
Becker was doing work on that decades ago, right? It's interesting
Yes,
that
yes.
a lot of these ideas aren't exactly new.
Yeah, yeah, it's really true. And I remember reading Robert Becker's book when I guess I was in high school or something. I can't remember the date it came out. But it really left a very, very strong impression on me. I thought, wow, we just have to find the right frequency for regrowing whatever. And of course, it turned out to be a little more complicated than that. But it was incredibly inspiring that he could enhance and even change the direction of the regeneration in the salamanders with a DC current. And this seemed to me to be something that's eminently worthy of study. And I'm quite happy that Mike Levin is doing this work. And there are a number of other people doing this kind of work around the world right now. Mike's the one I know best. And it gives me grounds for optimism, because I think with a concerted, directed research project, a lot is possible.
I know that you're working with Chi, with that group that studies the biofield. Could
Mm-hmm.
you say a word about what you're doing with Chi and where Chi is
Mm-hmm.
headed?
Well, we're doing our best to try to accelerate the science and practice of healing, understanding of the roles of consciousness in that. And this is a very, very multi or transdisciplinary approach. On one level, it's understanding more about how healing works in the body in terms of the clinical science and the biophysics of it. Whether it's healing due to something like Reiki, or just healing due to a positive interaction with a doctor. There's an interaction of consciousness, of intention. Even if Reiki is not putting out magical fields, perhaps the ritual act of being cared for by the practitioner puts one into a receptive state that allows the body's or the universe's natural healing mechanisms to come to play. So regardless of the scientific metaphor that's used, consciousness plays a role in healing. And I think we see this from psychoneuroimmunology, we see it from biophysics, we see it coming from a lot of different directions. We see it in so many of the ancient healing traditions where consciousness plays a very central role in both the diagnosis and the treatment. Different people with different constitutions will receive different treatments, for example. So at Chi, our director, Shamini Jain, I think recognized correctly that there's a need to encourage work in this area, that there are a lot of scientists who are working along parallel paths, and we've worked to bring them together to encourage discussion. We have a few study groups and a few research groups embarked on projects right now, composed mainly of members of our Scientific Advisory Council, but a few others as well. My sense as a scientist is that there's an inevitability that we're moving to an informational paradigm in biology. It's a paradigm where, rather than just looking at the mechanical nature of life, which we've made great progress with, we're beginning to look at life as more of an interconnected web and talking more about information flow. And of course, this relates to my work in bioelectromagnetics. So I think this perspective that Chi is espousing, this new paradigm, if you will, that you mentioned at the beginning of this conversation, it's already here. It's already in the mainstream science of today in many, many fields. We've seen incredible advancement. And we feel that there's a need to try to enhance this, in part because some of the subjects are taboo. When we talk about consciousness, it usually just gets relegated to an intellectual discussion and not something that's taken seriously as a potential variable in a biology experiment, the state of consciousness, for example. And we want to try to bring forth more of the expression, both in terms of the understanding of how healing works, but also an understanding of how we can enhance healing and how we can do that in a shared, collaboratory way in society so that we can create a healthier world.
What are some examples of the research projects that she's engaged in recently?
Well, the one I described where we went to Tamil Nadu a few months ago is part of a project called The Power of We, where we're looking at the group interaction and the power of collective intention. And one of the ways to do that is with electrophysiology, and we have a number of other techniques and some research protocols that we're using. So part of it is to get the work out of the lab and into the real world, if you will, or to help the science and the practice to dialogue. Another example is we've been having scientists have dialogues with healers, so that the scientists can better understand the healers' perspectives, and also so the healers can have a dialogue with the scientists and begin to understand, well, what would I need to do to allow a scientist to study this in a way that would produce a clearer view? And often those two types of thinking are a little bit different. So being able to have the people meet and learn about each other's traditions and then ultimately collaborate and do some experiments and see if we can understand these things better, I think is a very important step forward. Because the scientist is not a healer. They're not able to understand what that's coming from.
I had an interesting experience where I did a session on the phone with a woman whose cat was urinating on the couch all the time. And so I just clairvoyantly read the cat and said, he just wants more of your attention. She followed through with that, and he never peed again on the couch.
Ah, that's wonderful.
So yeah, it was so interesting because then I started like channeling the cat and how much disgust he had for the other cats and how in disdain he was. And she said, I can see that on his face sometimes when he's looking at the other cats. So it's amazing what consciousness. It's like the Akashic records the Hindus talk about. We can read the field if we tune into it.
I think so, and I don't have that kind of wisdom, but I think we all have the experience of something like this, where we have an intuition and it comes true, or we have a sense of what's about to happen in a few minutes, where we feel sensitive to a situation or a person in a way that we can't quite explain. It's more of a gut feeling often. Sometimes those things are driven by our fears and our aversions, so it can be difficult to be clear, but perhaps we have the capacity to sense things that we're not quite aware of.
Evolution would select for that, for sensitive people.
I would think so, or it
tigers
might send
here
them all to the loony bin. Yeah, it would actually. If you have a sense of if the tiger's looking at you and it's lunchtime for tigers, then that could confer an evolutionary advantage, certainly.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's very interesting.
What you do yoga? You're a musician. How does that feed who you are? Those other interests you have besides science.
Well, from my point of view, I think they all feed in together. When I was a kid, when I was 10 years old, my dad got real sick. He had a stroke. We spoke about it briefly before. And he was never the same again. He really couldn't speak right, or he lost the use of the left side of his body. And, despite the suffering that a little boy would have for that, it taught me a lot about impermanence and about not wasting my time. And I think it urged me to ask myself, well, if I only have as many years as my dad got, what would I do with them? And I did the best I could to follow the things I loved. And there were these three things, just the yoga and the science and the music. And I've had the good fortune to be able to grow in these areas throughout my adult life. And I don't know what to say other than I can speak about how it's important to have an integrative, multidisciplinary point of view, to have a healthy hobby and all that kind of stuff, so that we're more well-rounded individuals, the benefits of a liberal arts education and all that, which I believe in quite strongly. But I think that if I'm honest about what motivated me, there was this fascination. And I think just because of that childhood experience, when I was young, I asked myself, well, what am I going to do? And, I didn't want to be pushing shopping carts at the local supermarket. So I worked as hard as I could in the areas that I loved. And it's come out okay.
Mm-hmm. Why are you living in Italy rather than New Jersey?
Oh, I don't know. I have three passports, so I'm a citizen in Europe and in the United States. I did my Ph.D. at the University of Bologna, and I have a position at the National Institute of Biostructures and Biosystems here in Italy. It's a multi-university consortium for study of biophysics. And it's a wonderful creative environment to live in. You know, besides loving Italy, the academic environment here, I think, is very, very highly collaborative. The Italian cities are quite close to each other. People know each other. There's been a very high concentration of research in bioelectromagnetics here in Italy, due to a few people like Ferdinando Bersani here at the University of Bologna, Alessandro Chiabrera, who I first met back in the early 90s, when he would come and visit our lab at Mount Sinai every August when the other Italians were all at the beach. He would come and work in New York. And there's sort of an extraordinary concentration of interest and progress in bioelectromagnetics here. So that led me here, and I'm really, really happy with that aspect of it. So it's not so much that I'm one of the rats that jump ship and I can't stand the U.S. anymore, you know, because he asked me why do you live here instead of the U.S. But it's just the opportunities came for me over here, and it feels natural.
Mm-hmm. I'm asking everybody their birth order because you pointed out the study that rebel scientists tended to be later borns. Are you a later born?
I am. I'm the younger of two. I'd say my sister is fairly unconventional too, so maybe she's actually the one that breaks the mold, since she's the firstborn and not really that conventional in the sense that she's an MD who practices natural methods, mind-body practices, and so on and so forth.
Did you influence her, or she influence you, or both?
Oh, I think both ways. I think there's always been a connection there on these kinds of topics, and she's been a tremendous source of inspiration and information for me.
And your astrological sign?
Oh, November 26th.
So it's Scorpio? No,
Sagittarius.
Sag.
Yeah.
Oh, and
Scorpio and your sidereal.
That's interesting to me because Sagittarius so far are the most prominent in the visionary scientists. Do you have any idea?
That's interesting.
Yeah.
No,
I mean,
I have no idea.
I asked my astrologer friend, and she says that Sages ask deep questions.
Mm. Yeah, I guess. My sense, like with the way we began this interview, it seems to me like if you look at a lot of the data that we're looking at today in a number of fields of science that I've written about, there are some really deep questions that need answering, and I think that it's not possible to answer them without an open-mindedness towards things like parapsychology and mind-body science, mind-body medicine, and so on and so forth.
Do you know your Myers-Briggs personality type?
No, I don't.
I'm going to send you the link. You can take it.
Okay. Yeah.
So what's your next step? What are you really interested in learning about right now?
Well, there are a number of studies I'd like to do in bioelectromagnetics, funding permitted. And I'm very much interested in weak field interactions, not so much because they're mysterious, but just because there's a lot of experiments where we need to do some really basic baselines where we see the responses of things like cells and tissues across comprehensive amplitudes, frequencies, wave shapes, and stuff like that. So there are a number of things along that level that I'm very, very interested in. I'm very interested in continuing the work with Chi that we're doing with group meditation and looking at things like heart rate variability and brain waves. I think that the more we start to see that there are really physiological effects that occur in these practices and start to understand more of the synergy that happens in the social context, I think that can have a beneficial impact. So I'm very much interested in that direction as well. I'd have to say more or less simply continuing in the direction that I've been fortunate to go in. When I look at what's happening today in science, and our capacity to collaborate is just incredible. I can gather data in India, upload it to a server somewhere, and then send it to a scientist in California. so he can take a look at it and we can analyze it together. It's absolutely tremendous what the possibilities are. There's a sense that I have that I'm just searching for the right word. At some point, some years ago, I stopped trying to make the roadmap for myself. I said to myself, I don't know what I'm doing. I'm completely lost. And I just give myself up and I want to be of service. And please, I want to work and try to contribute to this place, this planet Earth that we're on. And somehow at that time in my life, when I got down on bended knee and gave up, things started to open up, maybe simply because I opened up and acknowledged it. So when asked what do I want to do next, it's not so much the question of what's on my agenda, what's on my bucket list, as I want to be open to being of service this way. And I found, over the years, since I've been able to trust in that more, it works. If I let go, somehow once I'm committed to that, then all manner of possibilities begin to emerge.
Mm-hmm. With what you know and feel, are you optimistic or pessimistic about our survival as a human species in the face of climate change, increasing inequality, more autocrats?
Yeah, or being eaten by AIs. I don't know. It's better than screaming zombies, isn't it? Optimistic or pessimistic is a hard choice. It's difficult. We got a lot of problems. Also, I can look out the window at the tower in the center of Bologna from here, and in 1943 there were airplanes buzzing around trying to knock it over with bombs. So, by some measures, we're actually doing much better than we were in some other times, and it's hard for me to really have a barometer on that longer curve of history. Are we headed for doom, or are we going to somehow save ourselves? I think it's really, really clear that we need to create a more stable set of structures in terms of our energy use, probably stabilizing the financial system so it's not so sensitive to the types of fluctuations that have brought it down a couple of times recently, towards becoming more empathic and more kind and all that kind of thing, where we more acknowledge our interconnectedness so we can work together, rather than sort of just basically have this case of the monkeys overrunning the ecosystem and having to go somewhere else, because somewhere else is kind of far away still.
Yeah.
Mars, I don't know how nice it would be on Mars anytime soon. So I think if we don't do that, we're going to have some big problems, whether to the degree to which global warming and pollution and so forth affect us or not. If we just don't find a way to have harmony amongst ourselves, we're not going to be able to make the decisions that enable us to counter things like pollution and global warming and the rise of totalitarianism or what have you. So I don't have that feel of like the kind of spiritual insight to know if that's going to happen, how much I'll see in my lifetime, or so whether I should be optimistic or pessimistic about it or not. But I'm trying to contribute to that, and I think that's pretty much what everybody wants anyway. Pretty much anyone you bump into on the street, whether they speak your language or not, they're kind of in the same boat as you. And I think the more we can see that, the more we have a chance to get over this. And you look at the way the world has changed, like the distance between France and Germany, or maybe England and Germany, is much less than it was in 1941. And from that point of view, I think we've already made some huge strides in a direction that would give me grounds for optimism, that we can do it, that we can somehow come together as a species and learn to make things work better. How to do that, I don't know. But I know that the work that we're doing with the sciences, for example, is showing us that we are connected in functional ways that are very, very important, and maybe in ways that we don't really have a typography for classifying yet. So this is exciting, I think, because people do believe in science. I don't think we're going to make a new church that everybody joins. It's going to be hard to have a one-world government that solves all the problems without creating more problems and so on and so forth. But if we can help people to have that sense of being connected with other people, somehow cultivating the love and the gratitude and the appreciation that comes from not being alone.
I
And
think
what a gift it is.
young people do have that sense, partly because they're on the internet so much. So they do have a sense of global issues and working together. I just read about the climate march that, the students are striking from going to school, and the three girls leading it in the U.S. have never met each other. One's in Minnesota, one's in Colorado, one's in New York. She used to live in California, and they're organizing this together. That seems to me kind of the prototype.
Yes. That's wonderful.
Yeah. Anything else that you would like to add, that you would like people to think about?
Gee, I don't know. Support us here at the Consciousness and Healing Initiative. We need your help. We want to try to move forward with the science and the practice of the subjects that we've been talking about. I don't think I have anything else I would request other than just thank you so much, and I have a great deal of gratitude for you asking me to this interview, and for the fact that we're able to do this, that we live in a world where we can put this energy out and hopefully move forward in a better way.